The letter arrived at the Dunlap Ranch on a Thursday morning in the autumn of 1878, and Paul Dunlap read it 3 times before he set it down on the kitchen table, and stared at the wall for a long, quiet moment that felt like it lasted the better part of an afternoon. He had known Maria Turner for 2 years by correspondence alone, which was a peculiar way to know someone, and yet, in the dry and unforgiving plains of West Texas, not entirely uncommon. They had been introduced through a mutual acquaintance, a widow named Mrs. Helen Caraway who lived in Abilene, and made it her personal mission to connect lonely souls scattered across the frontier. Paul had written first, cautiously, apologetically almost, as if he were not entirely sure he deserved the attention of a woman he had never laid eyes upon. Maria had written back with a warmth that surprised him, and then they had simply kept writing, letter after letter carried by the postal riders across hundreds of miles of open land. He had learned she was a schoolteacher in a small settlement called Caldwell Creek, east of the Pecos River. He had learned she loved the smell of rain before it fell, that she kept a small vegetable garden behind the schoolhouse where she grew tomatoes and sage, that she had come to Texas from Tennessee after the death of her mother, and that she had never once regretted the choice, even when the summers turned vicious and the wind stripped the paint from every wooden building within a 10-mile radius. He had learned she was funny in a quiet and understated way, that her humor was buried inside her sentences like a gift you had to read twice to find. He had learned she was brave, deeply and unpretentiously brave, in the way that only people who have survived genuine hardship can be. What he had not learned, not entirely, not in any full and honest sense, was what she looked like. She had never sent a photograph. He had never asked. It had not seemed necessary. The version of Maria Turner that lived inside his mind was assembled entirely from her words, and he had been content with that, more than content, deeply satisfied in a way that quietly terrified him when he admitted it to himself. Then came the letter that changed everything. It was shorter than her usual letters, and that alone told him something was wrong before he had read past the second sentence. Maria Turner was not a short-letter woman. Her correspondence was rich and detailed, and full of digressions that looped back into themselves in ways that were genuinely delightful. A short letter from Maria meant something had happened that made the words hard to find. She wrote that there had been a fire. It had started in the barn of a neighboring family, the Whitmore family, whose youngest boy had knocked over a lantern while trying to catch a barn cat in the dark. The fire moved fast the way fire always does in dry country, jumping the fence line, catching the dry grass, racing toward the schoolhouse and the small structure attached to it where Maria kept her living quarters. She had gotten out. That was the important thing, she wrote, and Paul could feel her struggling to maintain a practical tone as she wrote it, as if practicality were the only armor she had left. She had gotten out, but not before the fire had gotten to her. The left side of her face and her neck and part of her left shoulder, she wrote, had been burned. The doctor who rode out from the nearest town had done what he could. She was healing, she said. She was expected to recover fully in terms of her health and her function. But the scarring, he had told her honestly, would remain, would always remain. The fire had left its mark on her, literally and permanently, and she thought Paul deserved to know that before they continued writing. Before he continued investing his time and his words in something that she would understand completely and without bitterness if he chose to step away from. She wrote that she was scarred. She wrote that she was fading, which he read not as a physical thing but as something deeper, something spiritual, the dimming of a woman who had believed in her own future and now found herself uncertain of what that future held. Uncertain of her own worth in the eyes of a world that could be unnecessarily cruel about such things. She wrote it carefully and with grace, but she could not hide from him the fear beneath the words, because after 2 years of letters, he knew exactly how she sounded when she was afraid. He set the letter down. He stared at the wall. He sat there for a long enough time that his ranch hand, A weathered man named Clarence, who had worked for the Dunlap family since Paul was a boy, came into the kitchen and found him sitting there motionless and asked if something had happened. Paul looked up at him and said, "I have to ride to Caldwell Creek." Clarence looked at him the way old men look at young men who have made a decision before they have fully thought it through, which is to say with a mixture of fondness and mild concern. "That is 4 days' ride from here," he said. "Yes," said Paul, "I know. What in the world is in Caldwell Creek?" Paul folded the letter carefully and put it in the breast pocket of his shirt, close to his chest, which was not a thing he thought about consciously but was noted by Clarence, who had the quiet observational gifts of a man who had spent decades watching people. "Someone who needs to know that her letter did not change a single thing," Paul said. He was 31 years old. He had been running the Dunlap ranch since the death of his father 4 years prior, and he had done it well, with the kind of careful and consistent competence that earned respect without requiring dramatic gestures. He was not a man given to impulse. He was not a man who made decisions without turning them over first, looking at them from every angle. But there was no angle from which the decision looked wrong. Maria Turner had written him a letter that was full of quiet courage and quiet fear in equal measure, a letter that had essentially said, "Here is the worst thing that has happened to me, and here is the door, and I am opening it for you, and I will not think less of you if you walk through it and away from me." He was not going to walk away from her. He was going to ride to her. He spent the rest of Thursday getting his affairs in order. He spoke to Clarence at length about the ranch, about the horses that needed attention, about the fence line on the eastern pasture that had been giving trouble. He packed his saddlebags with the efficient minimalism of a man who had grown up on the land, taking what was necessary and leaving behind what was not. He wrote a brief note to his sister, Elaine, who lived in San Angelo, letting her know he would be away for approximately 2 weeks. He checked the shoes on his horse, a big steady bay gelding he called Copper on account of the color that ran through his coat in direct sunlight, and he made sure Copper was well fed and rested. He rode out before dawn on Friday. The country between his ranch and Caldwell Creek was not gentle. It was the kind of landscape that required respect, the kind that had swallowed men whole when they failed to pay attention to it. Flat open stretches of grassland gave way to broken terrain cut through with arroyos and dry creek beds that could flood without warning if rain fell somewhere you couldn't see it. The sky out here was enormous, the kind of sky that made a man feel small in a way that was not always unwelcome. There was a grandeur to it, a scale that forced a kind of humility, and Paul had grown up inside that humility and worn it naturally. He rode through Friday and made camp that night beside a dry creek bed under a scatter of stars so thick and clear they looked like something poured from a bucket. He built a small fire, made coffee, and read Maria's letter again by firelight. Not because he needed to reread it, but because the act of holding it, of having it present in the air between his eyes and the orange-lit world around him, felt like a form of closeness to her. He had read it enough times to know it by heart. He knew the exact place where her handwriting changed slightly, where it became smaller and more careful, which was when she was describing the burns themselves, when she was fighting to be matter-of-fact about something that was anything but. He folded it again. He put it back in his pocket. He stared into the fire for a while and thought about what it meant to know a person through their words, and whether that knowledge was real or whether it was some kind of beautiful illusion that the physical reality of their presence might shatter. He did not think it was an illusion. He thought it was the realest way he had ever known anyone. He did not sleep particularly well, but he did sleep, and he was up before sunrise and moving again before the sky had finished its shift from black to deep blue. Saturday was harder. The terrain roughened, and there was a wind out of the northwest that pushed against them with a steady and unrelenting pressure, the kind that dried out your lips and eyes and made the world feel like it was leaning away from you at all times. Copper handled it without complaint, which was one of the things Paul valued most in the horse, A complaining horse in difficult country was a genuine problem. Copper simply lowered his head and walked into it. Paul stopped mid-morning at a small trading post at a crossroads that had no name on any map he had ever seen, though the man who ran it, a broad-shouldered fellow with a red beard growing in all directions, referred to it as Hennessy's, which Paul assumed was a family name. He bought a can of beans and some dried corn bread and let Copper drink from the trough out front. The man with the red beard watched him from behind the counter with the particular alertness of someone who spent his days watching strangers pass through and had gotten very good at reading them. "You heading east?" the man asked. "Caldwell Creek," Paul said. "Still a good distance." 2, maybe 3 days if the creek crossings are passable. He leaned on the counter. "You got people out there?" Paul considered the question. "Something like that," he said. He bought a sack of oats for Copper and was back on the road within the hour. Saturday night he camped on higher ground, a low ridge that gave him a view of the plain stretching out in every direction, and the sunset turned the whole world a color he would spend years trying to describe accurately and never quite manage. Burnt orange bleeding into rose, bleeding into a deep and luminous purple at the edges. He sat on a rock and ate his beans cold from the can because he was too tired to bother with a fire, and watched the colors fade and thought about Maria. Not Maria's words specifically. Just Maria herself, the idea of her, the person who had assembled those words. He wondered if she was sitting somewhere watching the same sunset. He wondered if she was in pain. He wondered if the doctor's visits had become routine, if she had good neighbors who checked on her, if the children from the school had gone back to their lessons yet, or whether the schoolhouse was still too damaged. He realized, sitting on that ridge in the fading light, that he was in love with her. He had perhaps known it for some time, but had been treating it carefully, the way you treat something fragile, not wanting to press too hard on it before it was ready to bear weight. But sitting there, he understood it fully and without reservation. The clean and uncomplicated way you understand something that has been true for a long time and has simply been waiting for you to catch up to it. Sunday was the longest day. He crossed the Pecos twice, once in the morning at a wide, shallow ford where the water barely reached Copper's knees, and once in the afternoon at a narrower crossing where the current was stronger and he had to angle upstream to keep from being pushed off course. He stopped at a small ranch house around midday and asked the woman who answered the door if he might fill his canteens from her well, and she said yes without hesitation, in the way that people in isolated country tended to, because they understood that the favor might be reversed sometime. The favor was part of the social contract that kept everyone alive. She gave him a piece of corn cake wrapped in cloth as well, and he thanked her sincerely. That night he camped so close to Caldwell Creek, the settlement, not the creek, that he could see the lights of 2 or 3 buildings if he climbed to the top of a small rise. He did climb it, and he stood there looking at those lights for longer than was strictly necessary, and something turned over in his chest at the sight of them, a slow and weighty turning, like the hands of a very old clock. He made himself go back down to camp. He was dirty from 4 days of riding, and he was tired in a way that lived in his bones rather than just his muscles, and the last thing he wanted was to arrive at Maria Turner's door looking like something that had been dragged through the country on a rope. He would sleep. He would ride in at a decent hour in the morning. He would present himself as a man with a degree of dignity. He did not sleep particularly well this night either. He lay on his bedroll and looked at the stars and thought about the letter and about what he was going to say. He had been composing speeches in his head for 4 days and had discarded every one of them. Everything he imagined saying sounded either too large or too small. Too large as in theatrical and performed, too small as in inadequate to the scale of what she had written him, of what it had cost her to write it. He decided, somewhere in the small hours of Monday morning, that he was not going to say anything he had prepared. He was going to say whatever came out when he saw her, and trust that 2 years of knowing her through words had given him enough of a foundation that the right words would come. He rode into Caldwell Creek just after 9 in the morning on Monday, 4 days after leaving his ranch, and he was struck first by how small it was. Small even by frontier standards, even by the standards of a man who had grown up on an isolated ranch and knew that the idea of a town out here was a generous application of the word. There was a main street of perhaps a dozen buildings, a general store and a post office and a saloon and a livery and a few others, and then smaller structures spreading out from that spine, houses and outbuildings, and at the eastern end, a building that had clearly suffered damage and was in the process of being repaired, with fresh timber visible where the old charred wood had been removed. The schoolhouse. He stopped Copper in front of the livery and handed the horse to the boy who came out to meet him, a kid of maybe 12, who took Copper's reins with the practiced ease of someone who had been around horses his whole life. Paul asked him to water and feed the animal and rub him down, and the boy said he would, and Paul gave him 2 bits and asked him a question. "Do you know where I can find Maria Turner?" The boy looked at him with the frank and uncomplicated appraisal of children everywhere. "The school teacher." "Yes. She's staying at Mrs. Alderman's boarding house," the boy said, pointing down the street. "The blue one with the white fence." There was indeed a blue building with a white fence, and Paul walked toward it slowly, suddenly aware that his heart was behaving in a manner that was not entirely dignified for a 31-year-old man. It was beating fast and somewhat irregularly, as if it had just remembered something important it had almost forgotten. He had ridden 4 days across rough country, and now he was walking 50 yards down a dirt street, and that 50 yards felt considerably longer than the 4 days. He stopped at the gate in the white fence. The house was quiet. There was a rocking chair on the small porch, empty, and a pot of herbs by the front step that he recognized as sage, which made something pull tight in his chest because she had written about her sage. He pushed the gate open and walked up to the door and knocked. The woman who answered was not Maria. She was older, 60s perhaps, with sharp, bright eyes and white hair pinned back severely, and she looked him up and down with the kind of assessment that left nothing out. "Can I help you?" she said. "I'm looking for Maria Turner," Paul said. "My name is Paul Dunlap. I believe she knows who I am." Something shifted in the older woman's expression. Not softness exactly, but a kind of careful attention, as if he had said something that required weighing. "She's in the back garden," she said. "Through the house, if you'll follow me. I'm Mrs. Alderman." "Thank you, Mrs. Alderman," he said. She led him through a small and tidy house that smelled of baked bread and dried flowers, through a narrow hall and out a back door onto a small yard that was mostly dirt with a few stubborn patches of grass, and a garden plot along the back fence that was obviously tended with great care. There was a woman sitting on a low wooden stool beside the garden plot, her back to the house, her hands in the dirt, turning the earth around what looked like the last of the season's plants. Mrs. Alderman cleared her throat gently. "Maria, dear, there is a gentleman here to see you." The woman at the garden stool went very still. She stayed still for a long moment in which nothing moved except the wind in the dry grass. Then she said, without turning around, "Did he say his name?" "Paul Dunlap," Mrs. Alderman said, and Maria Turner turned around. He had thought in some abstract and unexamined way that he would need to prepare himself for whatever the fire had done to her face. He had thought there might be a moment of adjustment, the way your eyes adjust to bright light after darkness. He had thought it might require something of him. He had been wrong about all of it. She was beautiful. That was the first thing, the overwhelming and unarguable first thing, and the burns on the left side of her face and neck, which were real and visible, which were undeniably there, did not revise that fact in any direction. She was perhaps 28 years old, with dark hair that was pulled back loosely and dark eyes that were looking at him with an expression he could not immediately name, something complex and layered, something that held several different feelings at once, wariness and hope, and something that might have been terror disguised as stillness. He forgot to breathe. He stood there in Mrs. Alderman's backyard looking at Maria Turner, and he forgot entirely, for some unmeasured stretch of seconds, to take a breath, because his body had redirected all of its resources to the single task of seeing her, and had not left anything over for the purely mechanical business of staying alive. He became aware of it only when the need reasserted itself, and he pulled in a lungful of cool autumn air that tasted like sage and turned earth and the distant smoke of someone's wood stove. "You came," she said. Her voice was exactly the way he had imagined it from her letters. He didn't know how that was possible, but it was. "Of course I came," he said. "You did not have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "I wanted to." She stood up from the stool, slowly brushing dirt from her hands, and she turned to face him fully, squarely, with a deliberateness that he understood immediately as courage, because it would have been easy to keep her profile angled, to let the right side of her face catch the light while the left stayed in shadow, and she was not doing that. She was looking at him directly and letting herself be seen completely, and the effort that cost her was visible in the set of her shoulders and the line of her jaw. "Well," she said, and her voice had a slight tremor in it that she was working hard to suppress. "Now you have seen." "I have," he said, and he took a step toward her, which was not something he had planned to do, which was simply what his feet decided to do. "And I rode 4 days to get here," he said, "and I am looking at you, and I cannot for the life of me understand what it was you thought I would do differently when I arrived." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked away quickly, and he saw her jaw work and her throat move, and he understood that she was holding something back with great effort. "I thought you might be polite about it," she said finally. "I thought you might be very kind and very careful and find a way to say goodbye that left both of us our dignity." "That was not my plan," he said. "I can see that." Mrs. Alderman, who had been standing in the doorway with the particular quality of presence that meant she was listening to everything while appearing to think about something else entirely, said, "I'll put the kettle on," and went inside with the efficiency of a woman who understood exactly when her presence was no longer required. Paul took off his hat. He turned it in his hands the way he always did when he was uncertain of himself, which was a habit he was aware of and had never managed to break. "I know this is not how these things are supposed to happen," he said. "I know we were supposed to correspond for a while longer, and then I was supposed to invite you to come and see the ranch, and you were supposed to decide whether you could stand me in person. I know the order of it got disrupted by you riding across half of Texas without warning," she said, and there was something in her voice now that was very close to laughter, not quite there, but approaching. "Yes, well," he said, "you wrote me a letter that I could not sit still after reading, so I didn't." She looked at him again, and he looked back, and the autumn light came down into Mrs. Alderman's backyard and lay across the two of them like something deliberate, like something that had been arranged by something larger than either of them. The scarring on her face was visible in that light, fully visible, the way that direct and honest light makes all things fully visible. It traced the left side of her face from the edge of her cheekbone down through her jaw and along her neck, a permanent map of what had happened, the territory of the fire rendered in altered skin. He saw it. He continued to see it. It did not change anything he was feeling. "Would you sit with me for a while?" he asked. "I have been on a horse for 4 days, and I would very much like to sit down and talk to you in person." And something finally broke open in her expression, something that had been held very tight and very carefully, and she almost smiled, and it was the most beautiful almost smile he had ever seen in his life. "Yes," she said, "I suppose I would like that too." They sat on the porch in the 2 chairs that Mrs. Alderman produced without comment, along with a pot of tea and a plate of biscuits, and they talked for most of the morning. It was, in some ways, completely unlike their letters, and in other ways completely continuous with them. The letters had been a conversation, and this was the same conversation, continued, picked up in person the way you pick up a book you have been reading and find yourself immediately back inside it without any period of reorientation. He told her about the ride, the crossing of the Picos, the trading post called Hennessy's, the red-bearded man who had asked him if he had people in Caldwell Creek. She listened with her hands wrapped around her teacup and her eyes attentive in a way that he had felt somehow through the pages of her letters but was even more apparent in person. "What did you tell him?" she asked. "The man at the trading post." "I said something like that," Paul said. She considered this. "Something like that," she repeated. "I was being cautious," he said. "I am not always certain what words are appropriate for what I am." "And what are you?" she asked. Her voice was quiet but direct, which was exactly how she asked questions in her letters. He was quiet for a moment. The street in front of Mrs. Alderman's house moved slowly and peacefully, a wagon going past, a dog following the wagon at a comfortable distance, two women in bonnets walking with shopping baskets. Ordinary life, proceeding at its ordinary pace while he sat on a porch in a borrowed chair and tried to find the right words for the most important thing he had ever felt. "I believe I am a man who is in love with you," he said, "if you will permit me to say it that plainly." Maria Turner did not say anything for a moment. She looked out at the street, and he watched the profile of her face, the undamaged right side, the clean line of her cheekbone and jaw, and then she turned and he saw the left side as well, and he made himself see it with the same openness, the same willingness to simply look, that he brought to everything else about her. "You have known me entirely through paper and ink," she said. "I have known you through your words," he said. "I am not sure there is a more honest way to know a person. Most people would disagree with you." "Most people," he said, "have not read your letters." She made a sound that was definitively a laugh this time, a small and surprised one, and the sound of it did something warm and irreversible to something inside his chest. "You are a very straightforward man," she said. "I try to be," he said. "I find that it saves time." He stayed in Caldwell Creek for 3 days. He took a room at the saloon, which Mrs. Alderman regarded with an expression suggesting this was not her ideal arrangement, but which was, practically speaking, the only option available. He spent those 3 days in Maria's company as much as was possible and decent under the circumstances, which were the circumstances of 1878, where the rules governing the interactions of unmarried men and women were clear and generally enforced by the watchful community of a small frontier settlement. They walked. They sat on Mrs. Alderman's porch. They ate dinner together at the Caldwell Creek Saloon dining room on the first evening, which produced a noticeable stir of observation from the other diners, but no outright scandal. They visited the damaged schoolhouse, and Maria walked him through the ruins of what had been and the plans for what was being rebuilt, speaking about it with the practical energy of someone who had already passed through the grief of the thing and arrived at the reconstruction phase. He watched her face while she talked about the children, her students, and what he saw there was a light that had nothing to do with the fire and everything to do with who she was. On the second day, she told him more about the fire itself, things she had not put in the letter because the letter had been hard enough to write. She had been asleep when she smelled the smoke. She had come awake slowly, then fast, then very fast, the way danger accelerates time. She had gotten to the door and it had been warm to the touch but not locked, not blocked, and she had gone through it and into the night where the barn next door was a column of orange fire against the black sky, and she had been clear of the worst of it, she thought. She had been safe. But then a section of the schoolhouse roof had caught, and a burning piece of something had come down and caught her before she could move entirely out of the way. She told this without drama, with the same factual directness she brought to everything, and he listened to all of it without trying to minimize or reframe it, which he could tell she appreciated because she had spent 2 months with people trying to minimize it and reframe it and tell her it could have been worse, which was true but was not what she needed to hear. "What do you need?" he asked when she had finished. "Not from me specifically. In general, what do you need right now?" She looked at him. "That is a strange question," she said. "Is it? People do not generally ask it. Then perhaps they should." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the new timber on the schoolhouse wall, bright and pale against the old dark wood that had survived. "I need to keep teaching," she said. "I need the school to be finished being rebuilt so I can go back to the children. I need people to stop looking at me the way they have been looking at me since the fire." She paused. "I need to feel like myself again," she added more quietly. "And do you?" he asked. "When we talk, do you feel like yourself?" She looked at him and something in her face went still and very honest. "Yes," she said, "that is the strange thing. Yes." He proposed to her on the third morning. He had not planned to do it on the third morning specifically. He had thought he might wait, might give the thing more time to breathe, might observe all the appropriate conventions of courtship that the time and setting demanded. But he woke on the third morning with such a clear and unclouded sense of what he wanted that the convention seemed less important than the truth. And the truth was that he wanted to marry Maria Turner, and he wanted to tell her so before he rode back to his ranch, and she was left with nothing but the memory of 3 days that might fade and become uncertain in his absence. He found her at Mrs. Alderman's breakfast table. He sat down across from her. Mrs. Alderman, who was already becoming, in Paul's private understanding, one of the most quietly formidable women he had ever encountered, looked at him once and then at Maria, and then removed herself from the room with the tea kettle as her cover story. "I want to ask you something," Paul said. Maria looked at him. She had learned in 3 days to read the particular register of his voice, the slight change in it when he was being serious in a different key than his usual seriousness. "All right," she said. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. "I know that I have only been here 3 days and that we have only known each other in person for 3 days, and I understand completely if that is not enough time for you to have any kind of answer. I understand if you need more time and more correspondence and more of everything that comes before a decision like this. But I want you to know that my answer is already decided. It was decided before I rode here. The letter did not change it. Nothing has changed it, and I think you deserve to know that." The table between them was small and scrubbed clean, and the morning light came through the window over Maria's shoulder and fell across the scarred side of her face and turned everything in the room an honest and unlying gold. "You are a very unusual man," she said. "You have said something similar in 3 of your letters," he said. "I meant it each time." "I know." She looked down at her hands on the table and then she looked up at him. "I have not been easy to be around since the fire," she said. "I want you to understand that. I have been frightened and I have been angry and I have not been the best version of myself." "I don't need the best version of you," he said. "I need the honest version. Those are not always the same thing. I know." She was quiet for a moment that felt very long, and then she said, "Yes." He thought at first he had heard her wrong. Then he saw her face, which was very calm and very decided, the face of a woman who had weighed something carefully and arrived at her answer with the full weight of herself behind it. "Yes," he said. "Yes," she said again. "Though we should write for a while longer first. I think that is reasonable." "Absolutely reasonable," he agreed, though he could feel himself smiling in a way that he was not entirely in control of. "And I would like to meet your sister," she said. "You've written about her." "Elaine would love you," he said with complete certainty. "And I would need to see the school year through here," she said. "The children are already disrupted enough. I will not leave them mid-year." "Of course not," he said. She nodded as if checking items off a list. Then she looked at him and the formality of her list-making dissolved, and what was underneath it was just Maria, just herself, warm and real and present in the morning light. "You rode 4 days," she said. "I did. Because of a letter." "Because of you," he said. She reached across the small table and put her hand over his, which was the first time she had touched him in any deliberate way, and the touch was warm and brief, and it mattered more than he could have adequately explained. "Then I suppose it is settled," she said. He rode home that afternoon, because there was a ranch that needed tending and he had already been gone longer than he had intended. He left with her promise and she left with his, and they were back to letters again, but the letters were different now. They were letters between 2 people who had looked at each other in honest morning light and said yes. He wrote to her twice a week through October and November, long letters that he took considerable care with, and she wrote back with equal frequency and care. They wrote about practical things, the arrangements that would need to be made, the question of the boarding house and the Caldwell Creek School, and the distance between her current life and the Dunlap Ranch. They wrote about the children in her classroom, who had returned to their lessons in a repaired and freshly whitewashed schoolhouse in late October, which Maria described with a joy that was palpable even through paper and ink. They wrote about his ranch, about copper, about Clarence, about the nature of the land around the ranch, and how she might or might not find it beautiful. They wrote about the future. It was the first time Paul had written about the future with anything resembling pleasure. He had spent 4 years running the ranch after his father's death with his head down and his attention on the present, on the mechanics of survival and maintenance, and the future had been a vague and somewhat colorless thing. Maria's presence in his imagination, in his letters, had begun to color it in, and that process was now proceeding with considerable urgency. He also wrote to Elaine. He told her the whole story, all of it, including the fire and Maria's letter and the 4-day ride, and Elaine's response was immediate and enthusiastic, and she said she wanted to come visit the ranch in the new year and meet Maria before the wedding, to which Paul wrote back that this was a fine idea and he would let Maria know. In December, there was a difficulty. Maria wrote that there had been some trouble in Caldwell Creek regarding her continued position at the school. Not from the children's parents, most of whom had been supportive, and some of whom had been genuinely kind. The trouble came from a man named Hargrove, Daniel Hargrove, who was on the town council and who had taken it upon himself to raise the question of whether a teacher with visible disfigurement was an appropriate model for the children of the settlement. He had used words, Maria wrote, that she would not repeat in a letter, but that had amounted to suggesting she was a source of distress for the children, that she was unpleasant to look at, and that the town might want to consider finding a replacement. She wrote about this with restraint, with the particular restraint of someone who is very angry and is making a choice not to let the anger become the letter. But he could feel the anger underneath, and beneath it, something more tender and more painful, the fear that Hargrove might succeed, that she might lose the teaching position that was, as she had told him, what she needed most. Paul read this letter in his kitchen on a cold December morning and sat with it for a while. Then he thought about what Maria would want, which was not for him to ride off and do something dramatic on her behalf, because she was a woman who fought her own battles, and he had understood that from the first letter. What she needed from him was to know that he was on her side. What she needed from herself was to fight this and win it. He wrote back and told her that he believed she would handle it with the same grace and directness she brought to everything, and that if she needed him in Caldwell Creek, she had only to say so, but that he suspected she did not. He told her that Daniel Hargrove sounded like a man of small imagination. He told her that the children of Caldwell Creek were fortunate to have a teacher who understood both books and fire. She wrote back in January with the news that she had gone before the town council herself, uninvited, and had spoken. She had told them what she had told him, that her burns did not affect her ability to read, to write, to teach mathematics and history and geography, to love her students and show up for them every morning with her whole self. She had told them that what their children saw when they looked at her was a woman who had walked through fire and come to school the next morning, and if that was distressing, she would like to know precisely why. The council had voted 3-2 in her favor, with Hargrove and one other dissenting, and she had gone home to Mrs. Alderman's house and sat on the porch in the cold and cried for a while, not from sadness, but from the release of 2 months of held tension. Paul read this letter and felt something in his chest that was pride and love in equal measure, so thoroughly mixed that he could not have separated them with any instrument known to man. Spring came. The correspondence continued. They wrote about everything, about nothing, about the in-between spaces that are the actual texture of a life. He told her about a coyote that had been getting into the chicken coop, and the increasingly elaborate measures Clarence had taken to stop it, which had so far all failed. She told him about a boy in her class named Thomas who was 8 years old and had decided he wanted to be a blacksmith, and had accordingly begun treating every metal object in the schoolroom as a professional opportunity. He told her about the wildflowers that came up in April on the pasture south of the main barn, the bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush, and she wrote back that she had never seen bluebonnets and wanted to. He described them for an entire page. He was aware, while writing, that he had never in his life spent an entire page describing flowers, and found that this did not bother him in the slightest. In May, Maria wrote that the school year was nearly finished, and that she would be ready to make the transition after the last day of classes in early June. She had spoken to the Caldwell Creek Council about her replacement, had even written a letter of recommendation for a young woman from San Antonio who had applied for the position and seemed well suited to it. She had packed most of her belongings, which were modest, the possession of a woman who had already once lost most of what she owned to a fire and had, in the wake of that, revised her relationship with objects considerably. She wrote that she was frightened. Not of him, she clarified quickly, not of the ranch or the marriage. Frightened of leaving Caldwell Creek, which had become home, even after the fire, even after Hargrove, because home is a stubborn thing and attaches itself to you even in difficult circumstances. Frightened of beginning again. But she wrote that she was also glad, genuinely and deeply glad, in a way she had not felt in a long time, in a way that she was still learning to trust again after the fire had made her uncertain of a lot of things she had previously taken for granted. He rode to Caldwell Creek again in June. This time he brought a wagon, because they would need it to transport her belongings, and he brought Clarence, who sat on the wagon seat with the particular expression of a man who is doing someone a considerable favor and knows it but would not say so for anything in the world. Clarence had met Maria through her letters as well, in a sense, because Paul had been unable to prevent himself from reading portions of them aloud at the kitchen table over the past year and a half, and Clarence had listened to all of it with a carefully maintained neutrality that did not fool Paul for a second. They arrived in Caldwell Creek on a warm June morning. Maria was waiting on Mrs. Alderman's porch with 3 trunks and 2 crates and a potted sage plant, which she was insisting on bringing, and which Clarence looked at with an expression suggesting he was reserving judgment. The reunion was different from the first meeting. The first time, there had been the enormous weight of everything uncertain pressing down on both of them, all the things that had not yet been said or decided, all the ways in which the real person might fail to match the imagined one. This time there was simply joy, straightforward and uncomplicated. The joy of seeing the person you have been thinking about for months walking down a porch step toward you with a slight smile that is trying to be composed and not entirely succeeding. He stepped down from the wagon and went to meet her, and she came the last several steps with increasing speed, which was not very dignified and did not matter at all, and he held out his hand and she took it and he held it in both of his and looked at her in the June morning light and thought, very simply, "There you are." "You look well," he said. "You look like you need a shave," she said. "I have been traveling," he said. "That is not a sufficient excuse." Mrs. Alderman came out onto the porch then, and Paul took his hat off and thanked her with all the sincerity he possessed for caring for Maria over the past months. And Mrs. Alderman made a sound that was nominally dismissive, but was actually quite moved. And she embraced Maria with the particular fierceness of an elderly woman who loves someone and will not say it directly, which is its own eloquent form of saying it. Clarence was introduced and managed, through some personal heroic effort, to be genuinely charming, which Paul had not entirely expected, and which Maria apparently brought out in people. They loaded the wagon and drove out of Caldwell Creek on a clear June afternoon, Maria seated between Paul and Clarence on the wagon bench with the sage plant at her feet, and Paul, who was driving, could feel the warmth of her beside him, the simple physical fact of her presence. And it was both exactly what he had imagined and entirely beyond imagining. They took 4 days going home, the same 4 days he had spent in the other direction 8 months earlier, but these 4 days were entirely different in character. They talked. They talked the way people talk when they have been corresponding for 2 years and have saved everything interesting for paper and suddenly have the luxury of saying it out loud. They talked about books and about landscape, and about what they wanted and what they feared, and what they thought was funny, and what they found moving. Clarence drove the wagon when Paul got too absorbed in conversation to drive it competently, which happened with some regularity, and Clarence bore this with his customary and unastonishing patience. At night they made camp, Maria and Paul on opposite sides of the fire with Clarence as the very comfortable and entirely unobtrusive presence that made the arrangement both proper and only slightly ridiculous given that they were engaged to be married. On the third evening, when Clarence had gone to sleep with the speed and completeness of a man who has no difficulty in that department, they sat across the dying fire from each other, and Maria looked up at the stars and said, "Tell me again about the bluebonnets." "You will see them yourself soon enough," he said. "They are mostly finished for the season, but there will be more next spring." "Tell me anyway," she said. So he told her again. He told her about the particular quality of blue, not a uniform blue but variable, shifting between deep purple and something almost translucent at the lighter edges. He told her about the way they moved in the wind, the whole pasture moving at once like a breathing thing. He told her about the smell, which was a true smell, herbal and faintly sweet, not overwhelming but present. He told her that the first time he had seen them, as a boy, he had been so surprised by the idea that the land could do that, could produce that much beauty out of its own plain and difficult self, that he had just stood there for a long time and not known what to do with himself. She listened with her chin resting on her knee, her arms wrapped around her legs, looking at the coals. "You are going to make me love it," she said. "The land." "I hope so," he said. "You should know," she said, "that the sage plant is coming inside." "I assumed as much," he said. Clarence looked at it very skeptically. "Clarence's skepticism means nothing," Paul said. "He looked at our whole situation very skeptically for most of last year, and he is on this wagon regardless." She smiled into the coals, and the firelight moved across her face, both sides of it, the unblemished right and the scarred left, and he looked at both sides with the same ease and the same love, which was not something he had had to practice, which had simply been the way it was from the moment he saw her in Mrs. Alderman's garden. "I am glad you came," she said. "The first time, when you just rode up without warning." "I could not have done otherwise," he said. "I know," she said. "That is one of the things I like best about you. The inability to sit still in a crisis. The instinct to show up," she said. "There is a difference." They reached the Dunlap ranch on a Sunday evening, late enough that the sky had gone from orange to rose to the deep blue that comes just before full dark, and Paul watched Maria look at it as they came up the long road to the main house, watched her take in the low buildings and the pastures and the mesquite trees along the fence line and the enormous and unapologetic sky, and he watched her face carefully, wanting to know what she thought, what she felt, what she saw. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "It is very big." "The land," he said. "Everything," she said, he understood. The ranch was not small. The house was not large, but it was solid and well built, adobe and timber, with a deep porch that ran across the front and caught the evening breeze. The barn was larger than the house, the way it should be in working ranch country. There was a bunkhouse where Clarence and the 2 other hands slept. There were corrals and a smokehouse and a well with good water and the low hills to the north that turned gold in the late afternoon light. It was a place that asked something of you, the way good land always does, and he wanted to know if she felt that ask as a burden or as an invitation. "What do you think?" he asked. She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "I think I am going to plant the sage on the south side of the porch." He smiled. He could not help it. "That is the right place for it," he said. His sister Elaine arrived 3 weeks later, having ridden the stage from San Angelo with a trunk full of opinions about everything and what appeared to be an inexhaustible supply of energy for deploying them. She was 27, dark-haired like Paul, with her father's eyes and their mother's voice, and a directness that had always been somewhat terrifying to people who did not know her and simply bracing to those who did. She met Maria in the kitchen of the ranch house on the morning after her arrival, where Maria was already engaged in the process of quietly and systematically reorganizing the way Paul stored his kitchen supplies in a manner that was clearly more logical, and which Clarence, who had been consulted without being asked, had agreed was an improvement. Elaine stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Maria, and Maria looked back at her, and then Elaine said, "You are exactly as I imagined," and Maria said, "I am genuinely not sure what that means," and Elaine laughed and said, "It means I think I am going to like you enormously," and that was that. Elaine stayed for 2 weeks, and in those 2 weeks she managed to become Maria's person, in the way that certain people simply are from the beginning, the person you can say the thing you are not sure you can say and trust that it will be heard correctly. They sat on the porch in the evenings and talked while Paul and Clarence did the evening chores, and he could hear their voices from the barn, not the words but the rhythm of a conversation that was going deep and going well. On the night before Elaine left, she found Paul in the barn working on a saddle that needed new stitching, and she sat down on a hay bale and watched him work for a while. Then she said, "She told me about the letter." Paul kept his eyes on the stitching. "Which letter?" "The one that got you on your horse," Elaine said. "Ah," said Paul. "She said she never expected you to come," Elaine said. "She said she wrote it because she thought honesty was owed, but she did not expect you to actually appear in Mrs. Alderman's garden 4 days later." "What did she say when you told her you were not surprised?" Elaine looked at him. "I didn't say that, but you thought it." "I thought it loudly," she agreed. She was quiet for a moment. "She is worried sometimes, still, not about you. About whether she is enough, whether the scarring is something that people will always see first, whether it will always be the thing that defines her in strangers' eyes. It is not something that will be simple," Paul said, because he had lived in the world long enough to know that people were frequently unkind and that Maria would encounter that unkindness in various forms throughout her life. "No," Elaine agreed, "but she is not a simple woman, and she has you. She has herself first," Paul said. "That is what she needs to believe." Elaine looked at him with something that was the specific expression she reserved for moments when her brother surprised her, which happened less often than she would have liked. "Yes," she said. "Exactly that. Make sure she knows you think so." "She does," he said. Elaine left the next morning and the house was quieter without her, but it was the good kind of quiet, the kind that follows a lively presence and means you are glad for it and glad for the return of the ordinary rhythm of days. They were married in August of 1879 in the small church in the nearest town, which was called Deering and was a half-day's ride from the ranch. It was not a large wedding because their community was not large. Elaine came from San Angelo. Clarence stood up with Paul. Mrs. Alderman made the extraordinary journey from Caldwell Creek, which Paul had not expected, and which moved him more than he was prepared for, arriving on the stage 2 days before the ceremony with a wrapped package that turned out to be a set of 6 bone-handled spoons that had belonged to her own mother, and which she pressed into Maria's hands the night before the wedding with an expression that did not invite argument. A few of Maria's students had sent notes that their parents had helped them write, and these were read at the small gathering after the ceremony, and there was one from Thomas, the 8-year-old aspiring blacksmith, that read, "Miss Turner, I hope you are happy and I hope there is a good anvil near your new house." Maria read this aloud and then had to stop for a moment, pressing the note to her chest. The ceremony itself was short and plain, the way Paul preferred things, the way Maria preferred things, and when the minister asked for the vows he said them looking directly at her, all of her, in her simple blue dress in the small whitewashed church, and she said them back looking directly at him. And in the moment when it was done and he kissed her, which was the first time he had kissed her, There was a quality to the air in the room that was difficult to account for scientifically, but was entirely real. They rode home to the ranch in the afternoon, with Elaine and Clarence and Mrs. Alderman and two of the ranch hands who had dressed in their best clothes, and were sitting in the wagon with the self-conscious dignity of men who were doing their utmost. The sage plant on the south side of the porch had, over the 2 months of its residence there, grown considerably more robust, and had put out a burst of purple flowers that Maria had been delighted by. That evening, after the guests had been fed and the wagon had made the return journey to Deering with everyone except Elaine, who was staying one more night, Paul and Maria stood on the porch together in the dark and looked out at the land going away from them into the western dark under a sky full of stars. He had his arm around her and she was leaning into his side in the easy way of someone who has found the place they belong in and is not questioning it, simply inhabiting it. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. "This is very different from writing letters," she said. "Better or worse?" She turned her face up and looked at him in the dark, and he could see her clearly, both sides of her face, the full and honest reality of her, and the look on her face was something he knew he would remember exactly for the rest of his life. "Entirely better," she said, "though I shall probably still want to write things down sometimes." "As will I," he said. "Then we will write each other notes and leave them on the kitchen table," she said. He thought this was a splendid idea. He said so. She laughed, and the laugh went out into the Texas dark and dissolved into the sound of crickets and distant coyotes and the soft movements of horses in the corral, and all of it together was the sound of a life he had not known, was the life he was building, until he was already halfway inside it. The first winter of their marriage was a hard one, which was not unusual for West Texas in 1879 and 1880. There were weeks of cold that kept everyone indoors more than they liked, and Maria spent those weeks doing the things that she had always done, reading and writing, and also learning the particular rhythms of the ranch, the things that needed doing and when, the language of the animals and the land. She was not a woman who had grown up on a ranch, and she approached it with the same methodical attention she had brought to learning anything, asking questions of Paul and Clarence, and reading what books were available on the subject of cattle ranching, which were not many but were thorough. Clarence, who had begun his acquaintance with Maria with the restrained approval of a man who takes his time with people, had by December abandoned all pretense of restraint and was openly, and without any apparent embarrassment, her most devoted admirer. He brought her the first cup of coffee every morning before anyone else was up, because she had mentioned once that she preferred it very hot, and Clarence had apparently filed this information in a permanent and prominent location. He consulted her on things that were technically within his own purview, and she gave opinions that were, it turned out, remarkably practical for a schoolteacher from Tennessee. Maria began writing to Mrs. Alderman regularly, which Mrs. Alderman reciprocated with letters that were formal in style and entirely warm in substance, the correspondence of a woman who had grown fond of someone and was not going to pretend otherwise regardless of what she thought about sentiment. She wrote about Caldwell Creek, about the new teacher who was apparently doing well, about her own garden and her own routines. Maria read these letters aloud to Paul sometimes in the evenings, and they both came to feel a fondness for Mrs. Alderman that was genuine and specific rather than generic. In the spring of 1880, Maria discovered she was expecting their first child. She told Paul on a morning in April when the bluebonnets were in full force across the south pasture, which he had not planned or arranged but which was, he thought, very perfect timing on the part of the universe. He was at the kitchen table with his coffee, and she was standing at the window looking out at the pasture, and she said, without turning around, "There is something I need to tell you." He looked at her back, at the morning light coming through the window around her, and he said, "All right." She turned around then. Her expression was complicated, the way complicated news is complicated even when it is good news, when the goodness of it has its own weight and its own kind of gravity. "We are going to have a baby," she said. He stood up. He was not aware of the decision to stand up, his body simply did it. He crossed the kitchen and stood in front of her and looked at her face and said, "Are you well?" "I am," she said. "A little tired, a little unsettled in the mornings, but well." He put his hand on the side of her face, the left side, the scarred side, gently, the way he always touched that side of her face when he reached for her, not avoiding it, not drawing attention to it, simply including it in the fact of her, and she leaned into his hand the way she always did. "I am very happy," he said. "Yes," she said. "So am I." He wrote to Elaine that afternoon with the news, and Elaine's response came back with such velocity that he privately suspected she had written it before she finished reading his letter and had sent a writer to the post the same day. It was 3 full pages of enthusiasm and plans and very specific opinions about what names should be considered, which he read aloud to Maria, who was amused and exasperated in equal measure by Elaine's enthusiasm for having opinions. The summer of 1880 was hot, as summers in West Texas always were, the kind of heat that pressed down on everything and made the air itself feel substantial, like something you moved through rather than breathed. Maria spent the worst of the midday heat indoors with the windows open and a book, and Paul reorganized the outdoor work to avoid the peak hours, which was practical and also, he admitted to himself, driven by a degree of protectiveness that he tried to keep reasonable because she would have had strong words for him if he turned fussy about it. She continued teaching, for a time, in a manner of speaking. There were 3 families in the area around the Dunlap ranch whose children had no access to any schooling at all, and Maria, with the quiet efficiency of a woman who cannot help what she is, had begun doing informal lessons twice a week in the kitchen of the ranch house. 4 children aged between 6 and 10 sitting at the kitchen table with slates, while Maria stood at a chalkboard that Paul had mounted on the kitchen wall and taught them reading and arithmetic and the first principles of geography. Clarence, who was frequently in the kitchen at the hours in question, had taken to listening from the doorway, and Paul was relatively certain he had learned a fair amount of long division that summer. Their son was born in November of 1880, on a night when the wind came down hard from the north, and the fire in the kitchen stove was the best thing in the world. He was a healthy and robustly opinionated baby with Paul's coloring, and what appeared to be, very early, Maria's eyes. They named him James William Dunlap, James for Paul's father and William for no one in particular, except that it was the name that felt right when they looked at him. Maria held him in the days after his birth with the particular focused attention of a woman who is memorizing something, cataloging every detail, storing it in the most permanent part of herself. Paul sat beside her on the bed in those early days and watched her watching James and felt something so large and so specifically good that it had no single name, or rather it had several names, and all of them were true simultaneously. Elaine arrived a week after the birth, having ridden the stage from San Angelo in record time, and held the baby with an expression of such absolute adoration that Maria said she was going to be a problem. "He's going to be ruined," Maria said. "He hasn't been alive 2 weeks and she is already ruining him." "She ruined me as well," Paul said, "and I turned out reasonably." "Debatable," said Maria, but she said it smiling. James grew the way healthy ranch country babies grow, which is fast and with tremendous appetite and alarming confidence in their own importance. He was walking by 13 months and talking by 15, in the bold and declarative style of someone who has things to say and sees no reason to delay saying them. He was devoted to Copper with a passion that Paul thought boded well for his future as a horseman, and which currently expressed itself in Copper being led very slowly around the corral by a toddler of approximately 2.5 feet in height, while Paul watched from the fence with the specific expression of a father who is trying to let his child be independent while simultaneously prepared to intervene at any moment. Maria returned to teaching formally in 1882, when a proper school was established in Deering. The community had grown, slowly but steadily, the way frontier communities grew when the land was workable and the water reliable, and there were now enough children in the area to justify a school with a dedicated teacher. The position was offered to Maria, who accepted it with an alacrity that Paul found entirely unsurprising. She rode to Deering on Mondays and Tuesdays and Wednesdays and returned in the evenings, and on those days Clarence and Paul divided the ranch work between them and the care of James, which was a negotiation that Clarence won handily because James was extremely fond of Clarence and would stay with him without complaint, whereas being left with his father, while his mother was away, was, in James's view, a less satisfactory arrangement. The ranch prospered in those years. The cattle market was difficult and unpredictable, and there were seasons that were harder than others. A dry summer in 1883 that cost them 2 pastures worth of grass and required supplemental feeding that cut into the winter profit, and a fever that went through the herd in early 1884 and required sustained veterinary attention, and a quarantine period that was stressful for everyone. But these difficulties were navigated with the practical competence that characterized how Paul Dunlap did everything, and Maria beside him was not an ornament or a comfort in the soft sense. She was genuinely useful, practically intelligent in the way she had always been, capable of doing sums and writing letters, and looking at a problem from a direction he had not considered. In 1884, Maria wrote a letter to the editor of a newspaper in San Antonio. She wrote it because she had read, in that same newspaper, an editorial that had argued, with the self-assurance of a man who is very certain of himself and should perhaps be less so, that women who had been disfigured by illness or accident were best situated in domestic invisibility, that their presence in public life, in teaching or commerce or civic engagement, was discomfiting to others and ultimately unkind to themselves. She wrote a response that was 500 words long and perfectly structured, and completely devastating in the way that a very precise and intelligent argument is devastating when it is made by someone who has personal experience of the subject matter. She sent it without showing Paul first, which he found out when he opened the newspaper 3 weeks later and read it over his morning coffee. He read it twice. Then he read the editorial it was responding to, which made him annoyed. Then he read Maria's response again, and he set the paper down and looked across the kitchen table at her, where she was eating her breakfast with the composure of someone who has done the thing and is prepared to deal with the consequences. "You wrote this," he said. "I did," she said. "It is very good," he said. "Thank you," she said. "You are going to get letters." "Probably," she said. "I hope so. That is rather the point." She did get letters. A number of them were from women who had written with the particular kind of gratitude that is both personal and private, writing to say that they had experienced something similar, had been made to feel invisible or diminished or unsuitable, and that reading someone say publicly what they had only thought in private had mattered to them. Maria answered every letter. It took her several weeks, but she answered every one. There were also a few letters of the other kind, disapproving and occasionally unkind, and Paul read one of these over her shoulder without intending to, and felt the particular cold anger he felt at people who chose cruelty, the clean and certain anger that did not require escalation, but simply registered and filed itself. Maria's response to these letters was, characteristically, to write to the women she knew first and continue her life with the same composure she always brought to it. The editorial became, in a small way, known. It was reprinted in 2 other papers. A woman who ran a women's organization in Austin wrote and asked if Maria would be willing to speak at a gathering. Maria said yes, and rode to Austin in October of 1884, which was the farthest she had been from the ranch since her arrival, and she came back with the particular luminous quality of someone who has been reminded of the full size of what they are capable of. She told Paul about the gathering in the evening after her return, at the kitchen table with James asleep in the back room and the fire low and comfortable, and the night outside quiet the way ranch country nights are quiet, deeply and with real authority. She described the women she had met, their variety and their common threads, their intelligence and their particular brand of courage, the courage of people navigating a society that had specific ideas about where they should and should not be. She talked for a long time and he listened for a long time, and when she finished she said, "I feel as if there is more to do." "Then you should do it," he said. She looked at him. "The ranch, the school, James." "We manage," he said. "We will continue to manage." "What do you want to do?" She thought for a moment. "Write," she said. "I want to keep writing. I think I want to write for the papers. I think I have things to say, and I would rather say them where people can read them than keep them in a letter." "Then write them," he said. She wrote them. Through 1885 and into 1886, she wrote occasional pieces for 2 San Antonio papers and 1 in Austin, essays and observations about life on the frontier, and about the experience of women on the frontier, and directly and with her characteristic precision, about the experience of living with visible difference in a world that could be unnecessarily limited in its understanding of beauty and worth. She wrote about the fire without self-pity and without drama, as an event that had happened and had changed things and had not ended her, which was the most accurate account of it possible, and which resonated with people in a way that more emotional treatments might not have. Paul read everything she wrote before she sent it, not to edit or approve. She had made clear that editorial opinions were welcome and final decisions were hers. But because he wanted to, because reading her writing still gave him the same feeling it had given him in those first letters, the feeling of being let into a mind that was genuinely worth being inside. He told her this once on an evening in 1886 when she had handed him the latest piece and gone to check on James while he read it. When she came back, he said, "It is the best one you have written." She sat down across from him. "The same thing you say every time," she said. "Because it is true every time," he said. "You keep getting better." "You are biased," she said. "Catastrophically," he agreed. She smiled, and the evening light was on her face, and he thought, as he still sometimes thought in a way that was no longer surprising to him but had not become ordinary, how much the sight of her moved him, not despite the scars but with them, as part of the full and real and living thing that she was. In 1887, their daughter was born. They named her Clara, which was the name that Maria had been carrying around for a long time, she said, before she knew who it was for. Clara arrived in March with a quantity of dark hair that was extraordinary for a newborn, and an expression of calm assessment that Clarence said made her look like she was already deciding what changes she intended to make. James, at 6 years old, was initially uncertain about the new arrangement, and then rapidly became Clara's most devoted protector, following her with anxious attention whenever she was on the floor and interrogating anyone who approached her cradle with what he apparently considered insufficient care. This was very endearing and also occasionally exhausting. The ranch continued. The years passed with the particular quality that good years have, full and varied and punctuated by events both difficult and wonderful that keep the texture of life from going flat. There was a bad winter in 1888 that took 3 horses and required the kind of sustained effort that left everyone tired in ways that sleep did not entirely fix. There was a good year in 1889 when the cattle prices were high and the land produced generously, and they made improvements to the house, extending the kitchen and adding a room that became Maria's study, where she wrote at a desk that Paul had made for her from good cedar wood, and where the sage plant, now transferred into a proper planted bed outside the study window, grew large enough to be genuinely impressive. Elaine married in 1889, a man named Frederick who was a doctor in San Angelo, and was, in Paul's assessment, excellent in that he was intelligent and steady, and clearly devoted to Elaine and not overwhelmed by her, which was the primary qualification. Maria liked him immediately, which was the more important assessment in Paul's view since Maria was a much more reliable judge of character. Elaine moved into Frederick's house in San Angelo and wrote long letters and visited 3 or 4 times a year and remained, steadily, Maria's person and Paul's sister, and one of the great constants of both their lives. James turned 10 in 1890 and had become, by that point, everything his parents had hoped, and a few things they had not anticipated, which is the normal state of affairs with children. He was serious and curious and genuinely interested in the ranch, the actual mechanics of it, the cattle and the horses and the management of land and water, and he had a talent for it that Paul recognized with the particular feeling of a man watching the continuation of something he loves. He also had, inherited from his mother, a tenacity with books that led him to read everything he could get his hands on, and to periodically produce at the dinner table opinions about historical events that led to conversations that lasted well into the evening. Maria continued teaching and writing. The Deering School had grown and required a second teacher by 1891, and Maria helped select the candidate and trained him in the particular approaches she had developed over 15 years of teaching frontier children, which involved a practical flexibility that understood a child who had been up since before dawn doing ranch work before school might need a different approach than a child in an eastern city who had arrived rested and breakfasted. On an evening in the spring of 1892, Paul and Maria sat on the front porch after dinner as they had sat on many hundreds of evenings before, in the 2 chairs that had been on that porch through every season of their marriage, watching the sky do what the Texas sky does in the spring evenings, which is to say staging a performance that would not be out of place in a much more glamorous theater. James was inside doing his lessons. Clara, now 5, was in the garden talking to the sage plant, which she had always treated as a conversational partner. Paul looked at Maria in profile, the undamaged right side. Then she turned and he saw the left side as well, the familiar map of the fire that was simply part of her face, simply part of how he knew her, and she looked at him with the particular expression she sometimes had in the evenings, the one that was settled and content and at home in itself. "Do you remember," he said, "what you wrote in that letter?" She did not need to ask which letter. "I wrote a great many things in a great many letters," she said. "The one about being scarred and fading," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I remember," she said. "You were not fading," he said. "I know that now," she said. "You were never fading," he said. "Even in the letter, even when you thought you were. The letter itself was proof of it. You could not have written something like that and been fading." She considered this. "I think I believed it," she said. "In the moment. I think that was the most frightening time, not the fire itself, but afterward when the worst of the physical pain was beginning to ease and there was space for other kinds of pain. I thought something essential had been diminished. And now," she looked at him steadily. She was 42 years old and she was, he thought, even more herself than she had ever been, the years having done the thing that years do for some people, not diminishing but clarifying, burning away what was not essential and leaving the essential more apparent. "Now I think the fire was the worst thing that happened to me," she said, "and also, indirectly, the beginning of the best things." "That is a very generous interpretation," he said. "I am a generous woman," she said, and there was a gleam in her eye that was pure Maria, the quiet humor buried in the sentence waiting to be found. "You are," he said. Clara came around the corner of the house at a trot with a sprig of sage that she had apparently decided to bring her mother, presenting it with the gravity of someone delivering important documents. Maria took it and thanked her with equal gravity, and Clara went back around the corner with the purposeful air of someone who has completed an important task and is moving on to the next. Paul watched her go with the feeling he always had watching his children move through the world, a feeling that had no single word in English but was adjacent to wonder. "I would like to go back to Caldwell Creek someday," Maria said. "I would like to see it again." "Then we will go," Paul said. "In the summer, perhaps. Bring James and Clara. James will want to examine the Pecos crossing from an engineering perspective," she said. "Almost certainly," Paul agreed. "And Clara will talk to every plant between here and there." She might not be wrong to, he said. Maria laughed, and the laugh went out into the spring evening the same way it had gone into the Texas dark on the night of their wedding 13 years ago, warm and specific and entirely her own. He reached over and took her hand, and she turned her hand under his and held it, the two of them sitting in the old chairs on the porch of the house they had built together, in the country that had made them both and made them to each other, the bluebonnets just beginning in the south pasture again, the sage blooming purple against the wall, the sky doing what the sky always did, which was to make the world larger than anything you had planned for and more beautiful than you were prepared for, every single time. Without apology, Clarence came out of the barn with his particular rolling walk and looked at them on the porch and said, "You want coffee?" Because this was what Clarence said at this hour every evening. "Please," said Paul. "Please," said Maria. Clarence went back inside and they listened to the sounds of the ranch settling into the evening, the horses quieting in the corral, James's voice from inside the house reciting something that sounded like a multiplication table, Clara rounding the corner again with another sage sprig, as if the previous delivery had been a preliminary and this was the actual report. The stars came out one at a time and then all at once, the way they always did, and the air was warm and smelled of sage and clean dirt and horses, and all the particular good smells of a life lived close to the land. Paul thought about the letter. He thought about reading it at the kitchen table on that October morning in 1878, setting it down, staring at the wall. He thought about saddling Copper in the dark before dawn, riding out into country that wanted nothing to do with human plans, riding 4 days through wind and creek crossings and cold mornings, and a sunset that looked like something poured from a bucket. He thought about standing at the gate of Mrs. Alderman's white fence with his hat in his hands, and his heart conducting itself in an undignified manner. He thought about seeing Maria in the back garden with her hands in the earth, the stillness when Mrs. Alderman called her name, the deliberate courage of turning around and letting herself be fully seen. He thought about the breath he had forgotten to take when she turned and he first saw her face. The catch of it, the involuntary suspension of a bodily function that he had been performing continuously for 31 years without ever once thinking about it, derailed by the sight of a woman he had known through paper and ink, and discovered, in that moment, to be more vivid and more present and more completely herself than any version he had imagined. He had never quite gotten the breathing entirely back to normal, in the most honest accounting. There was something about Maria that still, after all the years and all the letters and all the evenings on this porch, did something slightly irregular to the mechanics of him. Not in a painful way, in the way that something genuinely beautiful does something to you that you could not have produced in yourself and could not undo if you wanted to, which he did not. Clarence came back out with 3 cups of coffee and set 2 of them on the railing within easy reach, and kept the third for himself, and leaned against the porch post with the ease of a man who has been part of a household long enough to know his own place in it and find it comfortable. "Good evening," Clarence said, looking out at the pasture. "Very good," said Paul. "Agreed," said Maria. Clara appeared again, this time without Sage but with a small and very serious toad that she had found somewhere and was carrying with both hands with the careful delicacy of a child who understands the fragility of small things. She held it up for their inspection, and then set it carefully in the garden bed with the sage, where it sat blinking with what appeared to be equanimity. "Clara, that toad belongs in the grass," Maria said. "It was in the grass," Clara said. "Now it is in the garden. I think it prefers it." Paul caught Clarence's eye. Clarence's expression suggested that the toad had made an excellent choice. Maria looked at the toad in the sage bed for a moment, and then she looked at Paul, and in her look was everything, all of it, the accumulated weight and warmth of years and days and letters and evenings and bluebonnets, and a 4-day ride and a breath he had forgotten to take, and a yes said across a small scrubbed table in a boarding-house kitchen, and all the mornings and all the work and all the children and all the ordinary extraordinary days of a life made together. "I suppose it can stay," she said. "Everything good can stay," Paul said, and it did. Everything good stayed. The ranch went on, and the school went on, and the letters went on. Notes left on the kitchen table, and longer pieces written to papers, and long, comfortable letters to Elaine and Mrs. Alderman, and the women Maria had met in Austin, and the women who had written to her after the editorial, and the network of connection she had built quietly and with great intention across the years. James grew up and learned the ranch and went east to study for a year when he was 18, and came back knowing more and ready to apply it, which he did with the seriousness and the latent humor that were his truest inheritance from both his parents. Clara grew up and had her mother's eyes and her father's steadiness, and an entirely original way of looking at the world that was entirely her own. And Paul Dunlap, on a great many evenings across a great many years, sat on the porch of the house he and Maria had made together, and thought about a letter he had read at a kitchen table in October of 1878, and thought about the 4 days he had ridden through rough country to arrive at a white-fenced garden, where a woman had turned around and let herself be seen, and thought that there was no calculation he could make that did not arrive at the same answer, which was that the letter had been the most important thing that had ever happened to him, and that the woman who had written it was the best thing he had ever known, and that the breath he had forgotten to take in Mrs. Alderman's garden had been the beginning of everything, and that everything had been exactly enough.